I'm Dan Elliott, Dan Elliott Transmission and Gear. Today I want to go through some of the, I've got a T-10, belongs to a friend of mine. It's having a little issue. I've got one that's all together, all in one piece. It's having some issues, but also want to go through some of the different parts and pieces that I've experienced over the last 25-30 years that I've seen. I've not seen everything, but I've seen a lot of it, and I'm telling you, if somebody brings you a transmission, a 5-gallon bucket, and you just got parts and pieces, you can go through some of this stuff. But the main thing is to make sure that you look at everything and check everything, disassembly, cleanup, and assembly, and then we'll go through some of the parts and pieces and see if it matches anything you have. We'll disassemble, clean it up, put it back together, and let's get started. I have my transmission bolted into a bench fixture that I made. It's relatively cheap to make, but it's easier for me to work this way, and I've done it for a long time, so I'm used to it. But it's a lot better than wrestling the transmission on the floor. The first thing you want to know is the transmission fluid drained. If not, you want to have a clean pan, and I like to drain into a clean pan so that I can look at the fluid and determine anything about the fluid by looking at it, whether it's burned, whether it's got any material in it or anything in it that should not be there, and give you a little bit of indication of what the fluid looked like and how the transmission was used or treated. Main thing you want to look for is cracks anywhere on the transmission. You want to look at it really good. I know it's not clean right now. We will look at more of that whenever we get to cleanup, but right now you want to look it over, make sure there's not any cracks, damage, or abnormal wear. You'll also look at the bolt threads in the rear mount and make sure the threads are all good. Now's the time to start looking at that. You want to look at the clutch splines, the pilot. You also want to use, if you have one, put a slip yoke in the rear, slide it in, see if it slides in okay. We can do more of that during cleanup. Front bearing retainer, you want to look at the front bearing retainer, see if there's anything about it. You also can shift this thing into different gears. If the shifter's not on it, you can use an adjustable and shift this thing and make sure it shifts good and that it doesn't allow you to shift it into 2 gears at the same time other than reverse. And it will allow you to get into reverse and a forward gear at the same time. And you can see if you have a neutral by shifting your reverse and shift the other gears and make sure you've got all the gears and it shifts well. If not, then you may have damage to the forks or the shifter or some other problem, and we'll find that and tear down. Also too, do you know any history on the transmission? What do you know after your visual inspection? I know based on what I see, someone's been into this transmission before. I know it by the silicone. I know it by the bolts. This is not the standard stock bolts. I know also too that this should be a press-in vent cap on the top. It's been threaded with an aluminum fitting screwed into the case, which is okay. That's not an issue. But this is where the vent normally is. This application looks like it was a race car. And there's also a grease fitting on the tail housing. We'll show you more of it whenever we remove it. The grease fitting was so you could grease the slip yoke whenever you put the slip yoke in. After you put it in to the car, you want to make sure there's lube on the slip yoke, and they used grease, which I really don't recommend you doing because like assembly lube, the grease has to wash away with low temperatures. That's why you have assembly lube and light lubricants to assemble this thing with. I use either Vaseline or white lithium grease. It has a low melt away temperature. Any kind of assembly lube or grease would be good, but I don't recommend any kind of chassis lube or wheel bearing grease at all. The speedometer hole in this one has been plugged. Another indication this has probably been in a race car. The transmission also has a cast iron mid plate, which is odd for any of the GM units to have a cast iron mid plate of the Super T10s, where it's aluminum case and aluminum tail. And like I said, the bolts don't look stock. and pretty much know by the washers on the bolts, because if this was a normal Richmond or GM application, they don't put washers on their bolts. I probably know it's been in a race car. Alright, right now I'll tell you that the tools that I use, that I recommend you use, you really do need to have a press, good snap ring pliers. I have a front bearing puller that really assists me a lot in the teardown of these units. Your normal wrenches, sockets, pliers, screwdrivers, pry bars, a good set of safety glasses, because anytime you are taking snap rings off or doing anything where you're going to be using a hammer or chisel, which I hope we won't be using, but the snap rings do break and come apart. I've been cut up the side of the face before, and especially on the hands. We need a dial caliper and a torque wrench, and then we can get started on this unit. Alright, this I just wanted to show you. This is a Quartermaster hydraulic release bearing. It's hydraulic. The hydraulic hose fits up here on the side, and I want to show you the different retainers that come on these transmissions, or you can buy for these applications. You notice this one, the front bearing retainer sits up against the bolts that hold front bearing retainer in. They're spaced out so that it is spaced away from the center part here where it won't interfere. So that's spaced out. Also, too, front bearing retainers, there are many types of front bearing retainers. This one is a billet, but it also, the different sizes. This one is for a forward throwout bearing, and it's about 1'4", will not fit where a GM is supposed to fit, but it's also made for a forward bell housing. You need to check this carefully to make sure your dimensions of your bell housing, your front bearing retainer, your throwout bearing are exact for your application. Other front bearing retainers are ones that are GM, but they have a bar that is made, that is machined onto the front of the retainer, so that the hydraulic release bearing sits back against those bars, eliminating the need for washers on the bolts on the front of this thing. Another front bearing retainer is what they call just a seal plate. If you have a bell housing that's got a T-10 hydraulic release bearing and it is mounted in the bell housing, you don't need the snout part that sticks out on the front of the bearing retainer. All you need is something to hold the seal in place at the front. And this plate, once you remove this retainer, this plate just bolts onto the front of the transmission. Then that way it fits up into your bell housing with your T-10 hydraulic release bearing. Alright, once we've seen these, we can look at the input shaft. This is a GM size input shaft, but take note, there have been Ford input shafts made for these that have got a Ford pilot bearing on the front. And you'll notice the difference in the sizes of a Ford and a Chevrolet pilot bearing. Just keep in mind there are different inputs and different combinations that you can get into if you have bought a transmission that might be used, or you don't know any history of it and you're trying to put it into your application. These I use for lineup shafts, whether it's going into a Ford, whether it's going into a Chevrolet. I've got the lineup shafts. I like it a whole lot better than the plastic ones that come in some of the kits. I like the real deal steel inputs. These, we cut the gear heads off of these just so we could use them for lineup shafts. Once we've looked at the front bearing retainer, and keep in mind that most of these front bearing retainers are cast, and if you drop them the right way, these things could crack or break right in front of where the seal area is. So on initial inspection, and especially on cleanup, we want to look at this carefully and make sure that the front bearing retainer is not cracked. Once the bolts are removed, we can slide this front bearing retainer off. It usually has a gasket on it. I've already taken this off and checked the threads and removed the gasket, but the gasket needs to be in place because the one thing that is definite on these retainers is that the way the bearing seats in the front of these, the gasket has to be there because it otherwise holds the snap ring up off of the retainer to where you have to have a gasket sitting on the front, otherwise it won't seal up. So just silicone in this will not work. You need a gasket. There are front bearing retainers that have been made to where the bearing sits down more where the snap ring is flush, but all you need is a straight edge to see if there is a gap there, and you can tell whether it needs a gasket or not. Once we've removed the front bearing retainer, we can now remove the snap ring and the spacer. And I try to keep all of my components together to where that we have all our components that we need. These we're just showing you the different types of front bearing retainers and seal plates. But once we get to here, we have a snap ring on the front with a spacer behind it. Snap rings can be a little bit difficult at times, and that's why you really need a good set of snap ring pliers. It makes the job a whole lot easier. We've removed the snap ring, and here is the spacer that goes on the front. Those I just keep together with my front bearing retainer. Once I've done this, I want to take off the snap ring that's on the bearing. We'll take off this snap ring off this bearing in the trans, because my puller is designed to pull the bearing by this snap ring groove that's on the front of this. Once we remove the snap ring, and there are two types of snap rings, so don't be surprised if you see one of the different ones. One's just a shorter version, one's just a longer version, depending on what your kit has or what the bearing had when it came. Normally the GM transmissions that I've seen over the years when they come from either GM or from Richmond had this snap ring, and if you buy a good bearing it usually has this snap ring, so don't be surprised to see either one. They both do the job equally well. Now my bearing remover is a Ford kit that I've had since the 70s. Works extremely well, and what it does, it goes over the front bearing and it captures the ring in the bearing, the groove in the bearing, as well as the tube on the front of the shaft here. Once that's captured in place, it's in both grooves, in the bearing groove and in the tube groove. Then I slide my retaining ring, and I can use the socket and a ratchet to remove my front bearing. These are great pullers. They work extremely well. They're a little bit difficult to find, but it saves a lot of damage that's normally done to either bearings, gears, or blocking rings. Once you pull the bearing out, you can release it. Release the two hives. Remove the tube. Then remove the bearing, and that's our front bearing. Sounds a little bit rough, but we'll do more of that when we get to clean up. Now we're going to remove the side cover. behind the cover. Before I do this, to ease with getting the forks out, I like to shift this thing into second gear, which is this back lever, back shift cam on the side cover, and shift it forward. Putting it into second gear allows you to pull the fork out without having to do that manually once you get the side cover off. I like to take these bolts out by hand because it allows me to feel kind of what the threads are and how good the threads are in the case as I take it apart. And I know if they come out relatively easy that the threads are probably good, but they could be sealed in with silicone or sealer. And if you'll take them out with a wrench or a socket instead of zipping them out with an electric wrench or an impact wrench, you'll have a better feel for what the threads are and can head off some diagnosis on thread repair. I also saw on this unit that the shifter bolts on the tail housing in this location, and I already noticed that it had a helicoil in one of the bolt holes for the shifter, which is somewhat normal since that's aluminum threads, but you just have to be very vigilant in inspection of these units. Alright, whenever you remove the side cover, if you don't have a nut and washer on the shift cam, you can actually pull the cams and the detents out of the cover as you remove it. So remove it carefully, and then you'll see you have the forks. And I try to look at each fork individually and see the wear patterns on them and how much I see with the forks, and if there's anything I need to do as far as a side cover or fork replacement. And then I want to make sure that the detents and the interlock is inside this little tube right here inside the side cover. Once my forks are out, we can carefully, because these detent balls are spring loaded, I'll shift it back to the neutral gate, and then I will push one cam out, knowing that there's a ball behind this, and then I can capture it with my fingers. And there is one of the balls, one of the detent balls. This is the 3/4 shift cam. This is the sleeve, and inside it is a spring and also an interlock pin, and this little interlock keeps it from getting into 2 gears at one time. So you want to make sure that you have all of these components whenever you disassemble this side cover. And I want to, every time we go to the mall, I always look in the food department for the different type containers to wash my components in. So just when you're out and about, these food containers, this is looks like a Parmesan shaker or some kind of shaker, and I use it to hold my parts in pieces so they don't get lost. All of this is, we'll put the side cover, we'll put all of this together. Also too, I wanted to show you on the side cover, this is another side cover that I have that is, it's got the shift cams in it, and how I determine if I need a new side cover or not is you can rock these shift cams, and if they have much motion in them, it needs a new side cover. And you can see this one has a pretty good bit of motion, and usually the most motion, the shift cam that'll wear the most is the 3/4 shift cam, is this one. And you can see it has movement. You can rock it back and forth. So if you don't replace it, you're going to have, whether you replace the seals on the side cover or not, you're going to have some kind of leakage. Another thing too is the different type shift cams, and I want to show you that right now. This is another side cover that I have, And you'll notice that this side cover is aluminum, which don't have any problem with. We raced these a lot, had really good luck with them, and most of these are sleeved where the shift cams go through. But you'll notice the difference in the shift cams, because these are billet shift cams. These are the stock cast shift cams, and they're friction welded. It's two pieces spun and friction welded together. They had so much problem with this through the years that they came back in and welded the two pieces together, which was a much better design. You won't break a shift cam that's welded together. Both of these pieces have been welded together. This is the billets, and usually the identifying on a billet is usually the fact that they're kind of got a dimple drill in the end of the cam, where these are just solid. But you don't find the billet cams much anywhere anymore. I've not seen many of them in a long time. Used to be really common. Alright, now that we've got the side cover off, we can look on the inside, and we want to pay close attention to our alignment of the speed gears and the cluster, because there's a little bit we can do about that if there's a lot of misalignment. This one shows up a little bit of misalignment only because I've got the gaskets out of the mid plate and the tail, and you can see the main shaft is a little bit forward on the gear set, but that's normal. Alright, so if we put it together, we get our gaskets in there and we still have some misalignment, we can add another gasket between the mid plate and the case. But you've got to make sure when you do that, this front gear for your reverse idler has to have loose motion in it. It can't be tight up against the case. It has to have loose motion. And as long as it's got loose motion, it's fine. But those little shims are about 25 thousandths thick, so if we have enough motion that we can put another shim in there, we need to add another shim, but that'll come during assembly. Alright, so we've got that part. We're looking at everything and we're turning everything, and don't see any gears that have any issue as far as teeth missing or anything in the bottom of the case that would make me suspect that anything was wrong with the gear sets. And the wire on the teeth looks pretty good. This transmission appears to have a good many miles on it based on the wire of the gears, but the gears seem to be in pretty good shape. But we'll tell more about that on disassembly, because the main thing we want to look at this point in time is the synchronizer teeth. And I know that the gentleman that brought this in told me that this transmission was jumping out of fourth gear. It was coming out of gear under acceleration, or whenever you back off the throttle and get back in it, it would come out of gear. So normally when that happens, it's because of the sliders. And once we start disassembling this, I'll show you the difference in the sliders and what you need to look for, and something that would aid you in keeping this thing in gear. But another thing that can make this thing jump out of gear is if you've got a pilot bearing that's bad, and the pilot bearing can make the input walk around and walk it out of gear. So several things we're going to look at whenever we get this thing cleaned up. Right now we're going to take the tail housing off. And what we need to do that is, there's a tapered pin right here that holds the reverse shift cam. We need to get it out first. And what I use to do that is always something softer than the pin is. The pin is a little steel pin. So I've got a little aluminum drift, and I try to use it to get the pin out. Sometimes it may require you to add a little heat to that because it doesn't want to break loose. It's been put in a little too tight, or it's been in a little bit too long. So I got a little propane torch, and right where the pin goes through, I try to concentrate the heat right where the pin goes through. Not a lot of heat, but enough that you can break the pin loose without doing damage to the pin. But the main thing is that you've got something softer than the pin is that you can use to tap this thing loose. And it's just a tapered pin, and once you get it loose, then you can which that one came out pretty easy, which that's your tapered pin. And now that we've got the pin removed, and I'm going to put this with my small parts. I'll just leave this right here. I've got a pair of soft jaw pliers, and I will pull this shift cam toward me. Alright, it exposes the O-ring on the shift cam, and I like to go ahead and take the O-ring off now because it's going to have to be replaced anyway, and it also helps me get the shift cam out once I get the tail housing off. And some of these things, if they've been in a long time, are extremely hard, as rubber does harden over time with heat and usage. So now we've got our O-ring. The shift cam is pulled out. Now we can take the bolts out of the tail housing, which, like I said, I've had this off just so I could clean the gaskets off to make this easier to come apart. You'll notice that there's 3 7/16 bolts, 3/4 heads, and there's there's 3 1/2" bolts and 2 7/16" bolts that hold this tail housing on. You can see here on the tail housing, you can see the grease fitting that was installed into this tail housing so they could grease the yoke once it was installed in the car. Like I say, I do not recommend this at all because the grease that they shove in there is a high breakaway temperature, and it could starve the bushing before the bushing ever got oil to it. So I do not recommend the grease fittings. Don't ever use one if you've got one, unless you've got a lightweight grease to go in it. Alright, once you do that, you can use a dead blow hammer to tap this thing left and right to break it loose. Just remember to be gentle on this thing. You can come up a little bit further, but you should be able to break this thing loose by hand. I hate to drive anything down between the cover, between the mid plate and the tail housing, because it is aluminum and you can do damage relatively quickly. Also keep in mind to keep a drain pan under this, because you're going to have fluid that would not drain out the drain plug once you break this loose. Then you'll have fluid draining. Alright, that should separate relatively easy. Just rock it around till it does. And right now we've got a fork on the inside that engages into the reverse slider gear, that as we rock it backwards, we've got several things that we're going to find. There is a thrust washer between your front idler gear that's going to drop down into the main case, so we got to remember it. We've also got some bearings on the back side of this idler that we've got to make sure that we keep up with as it comes apart. So I try to slide the bearing back, and I want to make sure I've got all the pieces when I do this. Be very careful that you don't overlook something on your disassembly, because it will make assembly a real bear whenever you can't find all the components or where they're supposed to go back to. Alright, we have to get in and kind of back up this little fork and the reverse slider gear, because our speedometer gear is in the way right now. So we have to make sure that we back off that fork and can get it apart. Alright, sometimes to get this reverse cam to let go of the reverse slider, you have to make sure the shift cam is shifted forward like it's in reverse, and you have to pull the reverse idler back with it, exposing your front idler gear, and it'll come loose. And this is what we need to see, is the fact that we've got a reverse idler with the bearings intact and our fork that could fall out if we don't place it. And this fork is what you have to work back out of your reverse gear, so it'll come by the reverse gear and allow you to pull the tail housing off because of the speedometer gear. We now have to remove the speedometer gear, but we've got our fork, a reverse idler, and our bearing and bearing cup. And there are two types of bearings, actually three types of bearings that I'm aware of. One is like a bushing with a tab, like a bronze or a brass bushing with a tab. And then we have one that's a cup and a bearing. And then you have one that's a thrust washer, a bearing, and a thrust washer. Because this is no longer serviced. So if you get something else in your overhaul kit that is just a bearing race, a bearing, and a bearing race, that will replace this one. Or if yours is good, you can go back and reuse it. But it goes back into the tail housing cup first, then the bearing. And on assembly, I'll show you this bearing assembly can fall out of pocket if you're not careful, and will actually sit down and cause that not to go into place. You have to make sure that you seat it back and use Vaseline or lithium grease to hold it back in place, but we'll do that whenever we start putting it back together. Also too, you need to inspect the teeth on the reverse idler, because this is what your reverse gear contacts whenever it shifts into reverse. Those two actually mate up together down here at the bottom of the transmission. So we've got those pieces. I'm going to put these parts with the small parts in our cup so that we keep up with all our pieces. At this point in time, we can take our reverse gear off, which is held in place by snap rings. And the snap rings can get a little bit aggravating on these things. Hard to remove. And when you remove snap rings, I try to always put them in place of where they go back in the same place, or I write down what thickness they are, so I'll know exactly what thickness I need to go back with. That's why it's important to have dial calipers. Is make sure you either keep your snap rings in the position that they were in, or make sure you keep notes of the thickness of these snap rings as you take them apart and where they go. Because once you get them in, mixed in with your small parts, it's going to be impossible to go back and figure out which snap ring was where. And there are differences in thickness of these snap rings, especially on the main shaft. Right, that's our two snap rings. And these snap rings are, both of these are about 90 thousandths. So I keep them together with the speedometer gear. Alright, once we've got our tail housing, then what I do is, if I know I'm going to take this tail housing completely apart, I'll go ahead and pull a reverse cam out of it, And I'll also look down in it to see if there's anything as far as, it doesn't appear like our bushings are bad, but I know that somebody has done this because there are 2 bushings in the tail housing. There's also where the seal goes in, they put silicone around the back of it to keep it from coming out. But it's got 2 bushings in the back of it instead of just 1. They've done that to try to eliminate some of the vibration that might be at the RPM that you race at versus what you run on the street. So we'll pull this reverse cam out. I will find a place and ease it into the vise carefully, or some way just to hold it, because you've got a spring and a detent ball underneath this reverse shift cam that's going to pop out of place once I push this in. And you can push it in with your hand, or you can tap it with your aluminum drift, and the spring will push the detent ball, and there's the detent ball. There's the shift cam. There's the detent ball. And I'll use my pick to get the spring out. And the spring for reverse is a yellow spring. If it hasn't been changed, yellow is the color that I see the most for the reverse spring. And the spring that goes in the side cover is usually a natural color, but the reverse is usually yellow, the side cover is usually natural. So I'll keep these pieces separate from my other pieces. I have a sugar shaker, and a sugar shaker works extremely good for the small parts. It's got a mesh screen in the top, so when you wash it out, you don't lose your components. Alright, I'm not going to take, unless my reverse idler pin is bad, I'm going to leave it in, and it looks good. It's a little bit hard to get these pins out because they have a cut plug in the side, they have a roll pin on the inside, and you have to go in and drive this to the center of this pin to remove it. Once you remove it, you can drive the roll pin out with the cup, and then just when it goes back in, you have to push the roll pin halfway in so that it holds this pin in place. It's a little bit difficult, but if this pin is good, I don't recommend changing it or pulling it apart to clean it up. You can clean it without having to do that. And this one looks really good, and you can see the cup plug in the side that they put in it. This is a race trans, so they didn't use the speedometer gear. The speedometer gear was still in it, which doesn't hurt anything, but we're going to leave it out when we assemble it. And we're not going to mess with the cup plug. And we will pull the rear seal out, which is a matter of just digging the silicone out and popping the seal out. No big deal. Alright, now we can pull our reverse gear. Will just come off. And notice how it goes back on, because the fork side has to be to the rear so you can pick it up whenever you put the tail housing back on. Alright, now we get to this part. There's only one bolt that holds the mid plate to the transmission case, main case. But at this particular point in time, I showed you the front reverse idler gear, and we've got to get it out of the main case along with the thrust washer that's inside. A lot of times it'll fall down into the main case, but that's our front reverse idler thrust washer. And this gear will come out once we get the mid plate and assembly out. So we got to make sure we keep up with this thrust washer. Alright, at this time we've got the input with the bearing off of it. I've not driven out the cluster pin. I'm going to leave it in. I like to press it out instead of hammering it out, because any mishaps that's going to happen with a hammer, you're going to do damage to the main case or to some other part. Alright, once you get your thrust washer out of your front reverse idler, all your tail housings out of the way, we want to move the one bolt that holds the mid plate to the case and place it right there. Notice that this bolt is thinner than any of the other bolts. It has to have clearance where it sits behind the tail housing. Once we remove it, we've got to be careful right now because we've got needle bearings in the front of this input, and as we remove this assembly, we're going to unplug the input from the main shaft and bring out the main shaft and the mid plate to the rear. So we're going to ease it back from the case, unplug the input, and we've got needle bearings in the input, so we want to try to drop it down to where that it doesn't lose any of them. And we want to be careful coming out so that we don't lose the pieces on the front of the input. And I just clamp it into the vise because we've got a thrust washer that holds the needles in the input that's on the front of the output shaft. And we've got our input shaft in the case with the needles that are already beginning to fall out. So I see that we have all our needles, and we want to make sure that we keep up with all of them. And I remove all of them and put them into the cup so they can be cleaned up or inspected and cleaned up. And you want to make sure that you don't lose any of these, even if you're not going to use them again. It's nice to be able to keep up with this stuff to make sure that it doesn't go someplace that it shouldn't, because there's a hole in the front of the input right here, and I think they will go into that hole, and yes they will. So you want to make sure that it doesn't go into the hole in the input and you lose one in that hole, and that you have all of them to either put back in or make sure you've got all of them. Alright, once we get that out of the way and our thrust washer, our needle bearing thrust washer, we can get that into our small cup. And we have our 3/4 synchronizer assembly with the brace, and we'll inspect our brace whenever we get ready to clean it up. We have a snap ring holding this assembly, which holds the second gear, or excuse me, the third gear onto the shaft, and then the output shaft has a ledge that separates second and third. So third and the synchronizer assembly has to come off the front, the rest has to come off the rear. This is one of the snap rings that it's important to know what thickness this snap ring is, because we notice right here that snap ring sets our clearance for third gear. Notice the movement there. It has to have that movement for oil, to get oil in between the gears and the synchronizer hub assembly. So we've got to have clearance there, and that needs to be there whenever we put it back together. Alright, that's that snap ring. And this snap ring is about an 87 thousandths. So far it's the thinnest of our snap rings that we used so far, and most of the time this assembly will come off. It's not pressed on the front of the input for third gear in this hub, and it slides off. And you notice there's our gear, our brace, and our 3/4 inner hub, synchronizer assembly, springs, and keys. And I know this thing was jumping out of gear, so I'll show you a little bit more about these once I get it apart and get it cleaned up. But I know this is a stock synchronizer assembly, and they make a better outer slider for these that will help hold it into gear. We'll do that whenever we get it cleaned up and get ready for assembly. So we've got our third gear and our hub, and that assembly is ready to lay in the tray. Alright, this is our ledge that separates first, second, and third and the front synchronizer assembly. And you notice we have some clearance for second gear to the shaft, as well as first gear. We have clearance to where it can get oil. At this time, I'm going to go ahead and remove the mid plate. It makes it easier for me to press this assembly apart. And all I've got to do is, there is a snap ring in this mid plate that once I get the snap ring pushed apart, and you notice the snap ring is kind of a reverse. You open it up and turn it loose from the bearing. It has clearance inside this mid plate to where that snap ring can open all the way up and release from the bearing. Because this bearing is pressed on the shaft, and we're going to have to press this off as an assembly. Alright, you see I'm now in the press. I like to press these apart. You notice that I've removed the spacer and the snap ring that sits at the back of the main shaft here, and by removing that mid plate first made it easier for me to remove the snap ring, which is hard to do. But I also marked the snap ring, and it is the same thickness as the one that held the 3/4 synchronizer hub on, which was about 87 thousandths. But you want to make sure that you don't get onto that ledge of the main shaft when you're pressing this apart. You want to be on the outside of the gear, down on the output shaft, and it should come apart relatively easy. We're now pressing the whole assembly off at one time. It's easier to do that way. Alright, and what we did was we pressed second gear slide on. The sleeve for 1-2 is a press on. The inner sleeve for first gear is also a press on. And then first gear, a spacer, and then a bearing. And that comprises our main shaft assembly. Alright, once we have our assembly pressed apart, we've got our bearing. We have our thrust washer for first gear. We have our first gear. We have our sleeve. This is the inner sleeve for first gear. And they've done to it what I like to do to these. If these are going into a race application, it's had the flats ground on it, usually by a belt sander. You can put the flats every 90 degrees and a good bit of width. This allows the first gear to get plenty of lubrication, because if that sleeve doesn't have the flats on it, it can't get the lubrication that it needs to last in a racing application, because this gear is spinning at a lot of RPM when you're in second, third, and especially fourth gear. This spins at a lot of RPM. So that's your first gear and sleeve. This is your 1-2 synchronizer assembly with the brace. And if you're careful with it, you can get all these assemblies apart without the keys and the springs flying out of them. And it's important to know the direction that these are supposed to be in whenever you pull these assemblies apart, because the 1-2 assembly, the taper will be toward the back of the transmission. On the front, on the 3/4, the taper will be to the front of the transmission so that we get our orientation right. But that's our 1-2 assembly, and this is our second gear. And here's your little ledge on the main shaft that separates third gear from second gear, so that your thrust load is against this little sleeve right here that's part of the main shaft. and this is our main shaft assembly. And if you notice this main shaft assembly, I'll show you the difference between two of the main shafts that I have. This main shaft has been gun drilled. It's hollow through the center and had a cup plug put in the front of it. This was racing application also. And what this does is allow you to get about 3 pounds off of the weight of the transmission, and this is rotating, which means a good bit. But also too, whenever you gun drill one of these, you lose the center points, which is the ability to check the run out of this main shaft at the surfaces where the gears run or where the bearing runs. So once you gun drill, you'll be able to use this shaft for a couple of races, but then you'll have to toss it because there's no way to check it to make sure it's straight. This one, after we clean it up, we'll show you how to check the main shaft to make sure it's true. This main shaft is out of a Doug Nash 4+3. It's got an automatic unit behind a manual unit. So all of the assembly to the front of the bearing is pretty much the same as any other T-10 assembly, with the difference being from the bearing back because of the automatic unit and the mid plate and how the reverse slider works. So we don't have to worry about this unless we're doing a Doug Nash 4+3, which the only part of the unit that I do not service is the automatic part. And I got a good friend that does that, so allows me to service these transmissions and get them back on the road. Alright, now we've removed our thrust washer for our front idler. So now we've got the front reverse gear, the idler gear that is in the main case, and it sits with the gear forward. The little sleeve down, turn down area, so we have clearance for first gear. And we'll lay that in the tray. That leaves the cluster. And I've seen people remove a cluster a lot of ways, but I like to remove a cluster in the press. And because if you're going to have a miscue, a hammer and a punch is not the way to get these out. And I like to be careful with these things and not do any more damage, and safest way to do it. And also too, at this time we can look and see how much clearance the cluster has in the case. It's not got very much, but it's got a little, how much it'll slide back and forth. It's got a little bit of clearance, but it doesn't have much. But it feels free and feels like it's rotating real well. Now we're going to take this out of the bench fixture and put it in the press. Press the pin out, and we have to make sure that we watch. We've got a little Woodruff key in the back here, and when we press it out, because it presses to the rear, the Woodruff key holds it in place, keeps the pin from turning. So we got to be careful we don't lose that key whenever we press this apart. And also 112 needle bearings, a spacer, and 6 small spacers. So we've got a little bit to do whenever we get to this part. Alright, I've decided to leave this in the fixture. I'll show you why in just a second. Makes it easier to get the needle bearings out without losing them. We had everything out of the main case that was loose. There was nothing else in it. The only thing now that we've got to be careful of is the Woodruff key at the end of this shaft at the bottom, and making sure that we don't lose any of the needles that are coming out of this thing. So at this particular point in time, I've got a small steel sleeve against the cluster pin, and I'm pushing it out the back of the case with the hand under where the Woodruff key will fall out to make sure I don't lose it. And there's our Woodruff key right there. We'll come on down and get the pin loose. Alright, our pin is loose. Alright, I'm going to hold the pin in place until I get back to the fixture. I'm going to turn it down where the pin can't come out. And I have a dummy shaft that I've made out of aluminum pin that I'm going to slide in to hold my keys, hold my roller bearings in place as I push the pin out the back of the case. This will hold the needle bearings in place to allow me to get them out without losing them. Yes, and sometimes they're in a little snug. Alright, there's our countershaft pin. And our cluster is sitting in there with the needle bearings, and we have 2 thrust washers at each end of this cluster that need to come out so that we can get this assembly out. And this one's going to come out with the thrust washer still in place. But you'll notice our little ring is still on the back of this. On the front and the back, it's still in place, along with our needle bearings that are still inside the cluster. Alright, so I'm going to lay this right here. There's our thrust washer, which looks a little bit on the badly used side. And they both feel like they have small debris embedded, some kind of material embedded in them, which most of the time is normal. Sometimes you'll get them come out that look nice, but that one is definitely got some debris on it. Alright, now our case is completely empty except for the plugs in the side, which I left loose and in it. We'll pull those out so that when we clean it, we clean everything. I'll drop these into my container with the bolts. So now the case is clean except for our threaded fitting that's in the top of the case, and I'm going to leave it in. I may reseal it when I go back and put it together. But now our case is clean and can come out of the fixture. And at this time, we want to take a look at all of the threads and the case and make sure that there's not anything that we see wrong with the threads, because now's the time. And as we clean it up, we can see more. And I've got a transmission case here that I want to show you how easy it is to overlook a crack. This is a crack in the main case that you can hardly see with your eyes, and it goes up to the top side. And this is normally where they break at, is right here at this left ear at the top. Don't know why, but it's a weak spot of the case. And if you've got one or you're buying one, make sure there are no cracks. And this is one of the things that you'll need to look for, as well as your bolt threads and the side cover, in the back for the mid plate or the tail, and in the front for your front bearing retainer. Now's the time to look at all of this and make sure you don't have to do any helicoils or find a new case. Alright, now we will put the needle bearings and the little spacers in our cup. There's 2 rows of bearings on each end, along with 3 of the spacers. And then we have a tube in the middle that separates the 2 rows of spacers. the 2 rows of needle bearings. Alright, that tube should have slid out easy, but it's got some debris of some kind in between it and the cluster tube. So this thing was due for a good cleanup. But that's the spacer tube in the middle. This is our cluster. And now's the time to determine what ratio transmission that we have. We can do teeth counts, because the tooth counts will tell you what ratio your transmission is. And you'll be ready to identify. I know by the input shaft that this transmission was a 3-ring, 3 rings on the input, and that tells me that this is a 264 first gear. And a 264, it comes in either a W ratio or an X ratio. And I've written down over here on my tray what those counts are and what we need to look for. 3 rings on the input can be an X or a W. First gear is the same in both, 34 teeth. Second gear is different in an X, 24 teeth, and a W, 25 teeth for second. Third is a 21 tooth third and a 22 tooth third in a W. Also too, the cluster counts are as follows. In a X, 28, 24, 21, 18. In a W, 28, 23, 20, and 18. And if you're looking at the cluster, this is first on the end, this is second, third, and this is the input set, which determines your other ratios. So let's see what second gear is. It is a 21 tooth, so this transmission is that's on the cluster, and that's second gear, so that would be a 264X ratio. So 264X ratio is a 264, 161, 123, as opposed to a W being a 264, 175, 133. So this cluster and transmission is a little bit higher speeded. It's almost like a 243S, which 243S just has a higher first gear but the same second and third. But now we can get into our cleanup, and that's going to be our next video. Will be once I get it cleaned up and get ready to reassemble, and that's going to be part 2 of our video. But I just wanted you to see some of the things that you'll run into. You can't measure enough or check enough when you have a transmission that you're buying from someone, or you have that's sitting that's not been into anything. If it's in a known car that you know something about it and it's running good and you just want to get in and refresh it, that's one thing. But if you don't know anything about it, if you're buying it and you're getting into it because it might have an issue or you suspect an issue, you can't be careful enough checking all of your components and making sure, because I'm trying to remember all the things I forgot about the T-10s and what was done, because there were so many components made for these transmissions for racing, for road course, for different street applications. It's beyond imagination what people have done to these units. They've been around a long time, and I've seen a lot of components and I haven't seen everything. So I'm just telling you that be careful, check everything, and we're going to do a cleanup on this, and then we're going to do a part 2 that'll be our reassembly.